Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Tom Parkin.
And me, Nikki Hill. And just to be sure, no, we are not tracking your data to make you pay more at the checkout today.
Yeah, that surveillance pricing thing really crashed into public awareness
Yeah,
this week, didn't it? Let's talk about that. And there's been this weird not knowing how much the Iran war inflation wave is gonna hurt
yeah.
people. And so that's a theme. We'll talk about that, and we've got the perfect guest to do that. Jen Pedersen, Broadbent Institute Fellow and Foreign Affairs Advisor. She's going to help us understand Carney's Davos speech. Why did Carney and Poilievre support an attack on Iran? We'll talk about all those kind of things.
But first of all, we're going to start with Below the Fold, taking a look at a couple of important stories that didn't make national headlines.
Nikki, BC Premier Eby has been very much above the fold the last few weeks over proposed changes to BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA. But there are also some interesting below the fold advances on treaties this week. So get us the info on that story.
Yeah, and we've had quite the wild ride in BC politics and probably the last couple of weeks. We even started last week with the prospect of an early election. We're actually more than 2 years out technically, but that was after Premier Eby said that amendments to the Declaration Act would be a confidence vote in the legislature. So if not supported, could trigger an election in BC. Knowing that the opposition BC Conservatives are already opposed to any changes because they just want the act to be repealed, which has been quite centered in their ongoing leadership race here. So they're in the middle of the leadership race. It has been like very focused on some of this anti-dripper rhetoric and policy change, and that's been carrying over into the legislature. Over the past little bit, the premier had been saying, when asked by the media, that he did have the full support of caucus and enough support in the legislature to win a vote if it came to that, and then announced we'd have a confidence vote on changes. And those were ranging initially from amendments to suspending certain sections. So we had First Nations leadership bodies, of course, high concern here. Saw press conferences opposing some of the proposed changes. These are really important relationships in reconciliation, implementing the Declaration Act. And that led to a lot of government caucus meetings and indications that there actually wasn't enough support in the caucus. And important to note, we have, three Indigenous members who are MLAs in the government caucus. So really tricky space here for them. By last Monday afternoon, the government House leader came out to talk to the media, indicated that when the legislation is brought forward in this session, which ends at the end of May, may be extended into June, that it no longer will be a confidence vote. So all of us out here had a deep sigh of relief about no early election prospect anymore, but also not putting DRIPA into the public discourse and political discussion continuously in terms of an election ballot box issue. So it's a pretty big shift we've had. And then interestingly, the snap election prospect also caused a bunch of ripples in the BC Conservative leadership race because candidates, of course, panicked that we might actually end up in elections, started putting forth prospects on how to truncate the race. So there are a lot of, I think now, still ripple effects and dynamics there going on as they get into some of the final weeks in that process.
Sounds all kind of chaotic and just like dropping a big stone into the water and watching all the impacts on the shoreline. And
Yeah,
it
it's been
sounds like
here.
a chaotic kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind. I think, it's a really complex issue. Thankfully, we have the pressure off an election and of course having this sort of important discussion within the context of an election. But I think there's still debate on how government is going to propose changes and continues. These are really challenging dynamics, not just for provincial relations with First Nations leadership bodies who've been very integral to implementing the Declaration Act, but also with ongoing misinformation about private property rights being spread through this BC leadership campaign for the Conservatives. And the Premier has said that government has no choice here, that they're protecting the province from unlimited, it's quotation, legal liability created by the Court of Appeal decisions in different ways in the past 6 to 8 months here. So, this Declaration Act, I think it was brought in by the previous government, but Premier Eby, previous being under Premier John Horgan, Premier Eby was the Attorney General at this point. Really a pride point, I think, for the New Democrat base of voters as well. But that being said, it's not actually top of mind for most voters if we look at recent polls, unless those polls are specifically digging into confusion around private property rights, which again is largely being driven by misinformation and largely around the conservative race. So, British Columbians, like all Canadians, are showing the polls that they're
Mm-hmm.
still mostly concerned with cost of living,
Yep.
healthcare,
Yep.
housing more than DRIPA. But an interesting thing here is probably why we're seeing it still in becoming in the disinformation side of the conservatives is that the BC conservative voters have much higher concern than the general public does. And it's hard to say at this point if that's because the party's been driving these
Mm-hmm.
messages, as have
Mm-hmm.
their candidates, or if that's, a real concern that's now permeated into the public discussion and feeling about will they or won't they lose property rights. Spoiler alert, Indigenous leaders are saying very clearly that that has not been on the table. That's not the intention. And so private property rights here are an ongoing challenge, I think, to communicate. But what we actually want to talk about is what got less attention. So fell a bit more under the fold, which is what we focus on in this segment. And as all of these shifts and tensions were going on, there was also a week in BC where two treaties were planned to be introduced in the legislature and were. And so I think, BC's lack of treaties is a core component of why we have these ongoing court cases. And so negotiating them and legislating them is, seen as a critical step forward by many if done in the right form. And if you aren't aware why BC is different in this regard from your province or territory, most land here what isn't covered by a treaty and was never actually ceded to Canada. But going back in history to when BC joined Canada in 1871, the province didn't actually recognize Aboriginal title, believed there was no need for treaties apart from the existing Douglas treaties. But that is a
Mm-hmm.
longer history lesson. We're going
Mm-hmm.
to try to bring in
Yeah.
someone with some expertise in the weeks ahead because this
Yeah.
issue is not going
I think there
away.
was also a little panic before because thinking the Americans might take BC too. So, get it in quick and
Yeah, there's
kind of let's not dot the I's and cross the T's, Anyway,
yeah,
that
exactly.
let's get into that someday. That's good. That's an
Someday
interesting
we'll have
story.
to go back in that
Yeah.
way back time machine too.
Yeah.
So let's look into treaties. So two treaties introduced this week is pretty monumental. So we had the Comox First Nation treaty legislation
Mm,
announced on last week. We had the result of 30 years of negotiations. So, you get to these very historic times. And then we had the Quetzales Treaty as well the next day, decades in the making again. Actually, interestingly, it was the former BC Conservative leader, John Rustad, whose ousting led us to this current leadership race for the Conservatives, who started the process of that treaty when he was the minister responsible under the previous BC Liberal government. So, these aren't new. These are underway they do take decades to finalize and negotiate. So both of these agreements here, they provide land, financial compensation, self-governance powers, including some expanded authority over resources, social services, and in some cases, aspects of justice. So it's not the end of the process. They have to go through provincial
mhm.
ratification. This was introducing legislation and then could come into effect in a couple of years. But I think, what's really interesting is they are the first modern treaties to reach this stage in more than a decade. So this, I feel like there is a feeling in general that this is renewed momentum on reconciliation, even as we have these broader tensions around Indigenous rights and land title and the province's approach to impending related legislation here. Quetzales is only the ninth First Nation in BC to have a modern treaty. I think that, when I see that number, it's pretty surprising, especially when we look at other jurisdictions. But there are, we should say as well that this week we have seen additional complications around neighboring nations' assertions on overlapping territory, and we still have to get through federal ratification. But I think, for these nations, these are huge steps forward for them and actually getting to the legislature. I've been in the legislature for treaties that have come in the past, and like the time this week, huge ability to have ceremonies, honor those First Nations contributions and culture, and I think really meaningful to be present for them. The other interesting thing under the fold this week on treaties has been the appointment of former BC Liberal Cabinet Minister George Abbott and former MLA of 17 years to head up the BC Treaty Commission. So, I think as that appointment happened as well, Abbott was again noting that this is a time for momentum in treaties, and as we can see from these two this week. But I think sort of going back on how we combine all of these issues, whether it's treaties or DRIPA, core to reconciliation is that government to government relationship, and we have definitely seen some fractured relationships here in the past month or few months as government and First Nations have been trying to address these emerging issues coming out of court cases and still move forward on commitments together. So I think we are in this phase where the project here for BC, and it's no small endeavor. I don't envy the government or First Nations who are trying to participate in these processes, but there is a real need for a path forward that ends some of this fracturing and creates certainty. And we're also seeing, I think, external attempts to cut through the disinformation about DRIPA. There's a new site. I don't actually know who set it up, but it's impressively comprehensive. Someone probably with some great academic and research skills set it up. It's called dripafacts.ca. So if you're actually looking to cut through the noise, go check out dripafacts.ca. And it's a great source of information on what's going on and what's true and what's not.
Probably somebody frustrated with the misinformation. I mean,
Yeah.
I definitely I would like to look at that because I personally feel quite confused about DRIP, and I know a lot of it is because I'm seeing information that's not right. I'm seeing misinformation,
Yeah.
but there's so much. It's like, how do you sift to say, okay, well, this is just untrue and junk. This is here for just to get people going, versus stuff that is in fact. Anyway,
Yeah.
I know that these are confusing times, but it's good to
Yeah.
it's good to see that there is still some momentum on getting
On trees.
treaties
Yep.
going forward. That's progress. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I think, these are going to be interesting times. We'll try to get someone on to come talk about it in the weeks ahead and
Yeah.
break it down a bit more. But I think definitely you're seeing people want to help cut through that misinformation that has been experienced the last bit. And I'm happy to see those signs.
Hmm. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, Tom, you have a very different story that's been building in the
Yeah.
Ontario labor movement for a
Hmm.
while, but one that perhaps more labor activists need to hear about in terms of what it means to their workplaces.
Yeah. In Windsor, Ontario, 27 workers at Titan Tool and Die are locked out. Usually companies lock out workers or take a strike when they want to force contract concessions. And this one is a little bit different. And it shows a real, I think, evilness on the company's owners. It shows how courts are stacked against workers and how the Ford PCs will back the worst corporate behavior, even as they claim to be the most pro-worker government, that the universe has ever seen in all time. Titan workers do specialty metal stamping and fabrication. So they take somebody's idea for a better metal part, they design it, and then they use precision equipment to stamp out a prototype so that it can be tested out before going to full production, or they go do sort of a short run custom production. That sort of thing. Uh, Last August, the company, from their head office in Michigan, forwarded the union 15 pages of contract concession demands and then locked out the workers when they
Yeah.
didn't accept them. And 9 months later, they are still locked out. The company won't say what plans it has for the plant, whether they will or won't even keep it open if the workers do negotiate a new collective agreement. And that is kind of at the heart of what is weird and kind of sleazy about what's going on here. During the lockout, Titan brought in scab labor to take materials and equipment out of the plant and load them into trucks. Local 195 of Unifor rallied local labor supporters to help the 27 workers block those trucks from taking away the tools they need to do their job, the real guarantee of the possibility of even negotiating anymore. But Nikki, I'm sure you'll understand what happened next in this story.
Yeah, I'm guessing the owner's lawyers went to court,
Yeah.
got a judge to tell the workers they were the ones breaking the law.
Yeah, yeah.
Wait.
The workers did block the trucks for a night, but the next day a judge issued an injunction requiring, even while negotiations are supposed to be happening, and the company isn't declaring a closure, that workers must let the trucks leave with their work equipment, the equipment that is essential to them doing their job. So no laws broken by locking out workers, by bringing in scabs, by shipping out essential equipment during a labor dispute, all while refusing to say if the workplace would reopen if the contract was settled. But obviously, this is bad corporate behavior. But what is less obvious in this one, and what is that super sleazy thing I was talking about, is what this company seems to be trying to do, shutting down the plant while not admitting to that in order to avoid paying the severances and post-retirement benefits that they had they had signed in their own collective agreement with workers. So apparently, as long as Titan's owners keep the company on lockout, the plant isn't legally closed, so the contract language around closure and severance, that language is not triggered. So in theory, if they can keep the lockout going forever, they never have to pay what they promised. Or if workers just get frustrated and quit, the company never has to pay. So the local MPP and Ontario NDP leader Mart Stiles visited the picket line last weekend to raise the profile of this conflict. And honestly, that's where I'd heard of this before, but I read more about it. And this is where I thought, this is really does deserve more attention. They visited with media to raise publicity about it and urge the Ford government to pass legislation to close this lockout loophole. She made the point that an anti-scab law would have prevented the equipment from being removed, and maybe the jobs could restart. Or at least the company would need to negotiate a proper closure so that they could take their equipment. But the response from the Minister of Labour, David Piccini, was just to say that he will always stand up to protect workers, and he had a mediator standing by, and that was it. That was it.
Right.
You know, some of these folks have been at this plant for a long time, so 30 and 40 years, I understand, by what I've read in the news.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so imagine being a 30-year Titan employee, maybe a man, mostly men in this plant, in his 50s, having your job taken from you, having your severance taken from you, your equipment taken from you, and getting treated like garbage by the people you made money for, and then listening to this minor bird of a minister. If this company can successfully use this tactic against Titan workers to rob them of their severance in Windsor, then other companies will use this more against other workers in other places. I don't think that's what Canadians want. But this story is buried so far below the fold that no one will see this problem until it comes to hit them. Or unless people like us, Nikki, and others start championing this story and supporting these workers to get this law fixed.
Well, I mean, particularly when we're in this time where, we were just talking about polls in the context of DRPA, but I think across the country, we're seeing Canadians concerned about economy, jobs, cost of living, right? So I think this is the time where that certainty for people is more important than ever, and the precarity of life. So yeah, I think you want to see leaders who are stepping in to do protection of workers when we're dealing with all of these changes.
Yeah, and I wonder really how long the Ford government could hold the line on everything's great and don't look. If this does get some traction, if the Ontario labor movement builds a little bit of a campaign, part of the problem here is of course, Unifor, it's Unifor, and they're not in the Ontario Federation of Labor. But that shouldn't stop good labor people from rallying together, nor should it stop the New Democrats from making a case of this. This is about workers, number one. And this is about people having their rights taken away after long-time service. I just find this story frustrating and abhorrent. Anyway. Okay, let's take a quick break and be right back with Jen Pedersen. Jen Pedersen, welcome to Left, East to West. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you took your passion for international politics through a PhD and have gone on to publish research and analyses on international arms trade and some hot conflicts like Yemen and in Liberia. You've been a foreign affairs advisor to NGOs and MPs, and now you're a Broadbent Institute Leadership Fellow and a policy advisor to the Federal NDP on Global Affairs. So you're joining us today from Ottawa, yes? And Jen, has spring finally come to the nation's capital?
It finally has. The crocuses are out, and we can hear the song sparrows today, which is really lovely.
Okay, this is usually the part where Nikki jumps in and talks about how the crocuses came out in January or something, and then that's the end of the show because
We're
I
into
get upset.
tulips now. Well, thanks for joining us, Jen. And so for you and for our listeners, we don't normally focus on foreign affairs on this show, although our very first episode was on defense, and so in some ways. But we're more about affordability, building industries and jobs, and investing in public services. So we know that, of course, Canadians are following what's going on in the world more than ever right now, and the impact in terms of voting, political choices, and how we're thinking about politics right here at home. And because that's largely because we have Trump now, and that has changed the dynamic so much, as you know, attacking our jobs, launching wars with global economic blowback. So here I just want to talk about making the case here. How does the world we are in affect the country that we're trying to build? And if our focus is here in Canada, why do we need to engage out there with the geopolitical climate?
I think we've always needed to focus on the global picture. Canada's economy has largely been dependent on the United States, but the rest of the world. And when the world goes well, Canada goes well. I think for a long time we were insulated from some of the conflicts happening in the world, but with the U.S. no longer a reliable ally or trading partner, that's no longer the case. There's new demands for us as Canadians from Trump, the Golden Dome, which is just bananas, defense spending, critical minerals questions, the tariffs. So these all have massive domestic implications. And I think there's also implications for where Canada is to be placed in the world now that the U.S. is withdrawing from multilateral institutions, right? Canadians are going to be increasingly vulnerable to the U.S. withdrawing from support for Ukraine, for development, canceling U.S. aid, closing U.S. aid entirely, which means that we're potentially more vulnerable, I think, to global health crises. And so, this is all going to affect us quite a lot.
In this current Iran war, it seems, this connection between what is happening inside our country, inflation and jobs, and what's happening outside of our country in war, really that connection seems to be quite strong in this case. And I think the thing that puzzles me, Jen, and I want you to help me if you can explain. It just seems ridiculous to me that the Trump administration didn't expect Iran to bomb energy infrastructure and choke shipping lanes. That would cause a wave of fuel price hikes and a significant economic damage, really around the world. And so, by the same, it seems ridiculous to think that our government didn't also expect this once they were informed of what was happening. But despite that, the Prime Minister and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre endorsed Trump's attack. So, the part I'm asking you to help make sense to me is why the joint support for a war with such disastrous effects on Canadians, a war Canada was never even consulted about, and that the Canadian government does not know the goals for.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think I don't have an answer to that as to why, right? I think a lot of Canadians were really shocked, actually, especially since this happened after the Davos speech. They were shocked that Carney came out so quickly in support of this war. And I think he got a lot of blowback for it, rightfully so. There's no appetite among Canadians for this kind of war. I mean, there is for like a small group of folks, but for the majority of people are saying, like, we've seen this before. We know what the consequences are. And if we think about the consequences specifically just for Canadians, beyond the human toll, the environmental toll in the Middle East, the consequences that we're now seeing in the next couple of weeks and months, it's not just the rising gas prices, it's also fuel for aviation industry may run out soon, the fertilizer shortages, including, nitrogen, that could lead to food insecurity. We are seeing helium shortages that could affect not just, the building computer chips, but also MRI machines, right? And there's Canadians waiting for MRIs. So I think there's real reasons why Canadians should be a little bit worried about the effect on supply chains, the effect on shipping, given that our global economy is so complex and that we are dependent on a lot of this. And Carney's inability to support international law in certain cases is just a travesty, right? He's picking and choosing where the UN Charter matters, where it doesn't, where Canada's going to speak up and where it doesn't. And I think we expect that from Poilievre. He has like a little bit of a MAGA ideology, I think, and certainly in his caucus, if not him alone. But we expect from Carney some kind of support for rules, right? Especially after Davos. And we haven't seen that with respect to Iran.
Can I just throw one, Nikki, if you don't mind? Can I just throw one supplementary in here on this point? Is thinking very politically. I mean, you're in the world of being a political advisor on foreign affairs. Do you think it's possibly because we know what Pierre Poilievre's position will be on these kind of things? It will be yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Trump, I'll follow you in any war. And so Mr. Carney just kind of adopts that position because it's one more way of bigfooting the Conservatives, which seems to be the overall strategy of this government, whether it's on economic, now social policy in some ways.
I'm not sure.
I'm just not seeing the upside for politically.
Yeah, and I'm actually not sure that Poilievre would even have been a factor in this particular case. I mean, there are some domestic constituencies that would have been requesting support for Carney for this. But what's very interesting, too, is to see the contrast between his support for Iran and then his clarity on the Lebanon conflict, like a month later, where he said, well, this is clearly an illegal invasion. The consistency there is that Carney has done nothing to stop either of them, right? And will never call out Israel in particular. It never applied sanctions. But it is very interesting to see the difference in how he is talking about Lebanon versus Iran. I suspect it's possible that because the Lebanese Canadian population is so large, like up to 400,000 people, there are so many Canadians who are so affected by this war, who have lost family members, who have lost, their families have lost their homes. I wonder how much that is playing into it. But then there's a lot of Iranian Canadians now who are deeply upset as well by Canada's inaction. So these are questions that we have asked, from the New Democratic perspective for years, and we don't have clear answers on.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about some of building that out on some of the larger connections on how conflicts elsewhere are raising risks for Canadians. So, of course, we've seen the Gaza genocide, we've got the abduction of the Venezuelan president, Trump's aborted attempts to take Greenland, threat us, the blockade of trade to Cuba, and then now the Iran war. So there's sort of two questions here. One, what is the through line in these unilateral actions by Trump that should raise concerns for Canadians? And second, with the exception of Greenland, what accounts for silence or support from Carney and Poilievre when the consensus has been that Canada's always best served by multilateralism?
These are great questions. I think the through line, first of all, for explaining Trump's actions is complete disregard for international law, complete unpredictability. It's like the Wild West, apparently, in the White House, there's no rules. And whatever happens, because there's people who will profit from it in Trump's circle, right? It's none of this is actually for the American people or for the good of the world, right? And I think Canadians are rightfully concerned that because these actions are so unpredictable, Canada could be next. We have to be pretty aware of that. And there's a cost to Canada as these conflicts continue. There's the economic cost, not just currently, and as we're seeing with Iran, but also if we think about the decades of reconstruction that are going to have to happen either in Gaza or Lebanon or wherever, and who's going to pay for that? Largely going to be donors like Canada, right? There's the human cost where so many Canadians have lost loved ones, including, for example, in Ukraine. There's legal implications that one day Canada may be found complicit in some of these conflicts, including especially in the genocide in Gaza. If we look at the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion and our obligations under the Genocide Convention. And then there's this other very real challenge that I worry about, that insecurity breeds more insecurity. And because there is no path to a sustainable peace in any of these situations currently, because we have no kind of savior coming in to say, everything's going to be okay, it's going to get worse. So it's going to get worse for folks there, and it's going to get worse for us here. And I'm not surprised by the silence of Carney and the Liberals on some of this. their refusal to take action on the genocide in Gaza or call out the United States role in that over the last 3 years has been, you know, a blatant contribution to the decline of the rules-based international order. And the Conservatives have never stood for international law. So, you know, I'm deeply worried about all of this. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and I think it's that sort of uncertainty that now Canadians never felt from below the border. I was, I think was really struck. There was the wild story from the royal biographer who said that Trump only really changed position on annexing parts of Canada close to the border, where I sit in BC, not so far from the border, because he found out that we were part of the Commonwealth. So, you're like the precarity of these decisions sitting so close to us as Canadians, too, I think is raising a lot of concern for people when we see some of these other conflicts.
And when you see folks like Pete Hegseth, and quoting what he thinks is a Bible verse, and it turns out to be, a line from Pulp Fiction, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, you're not sending your best and brightest here. So,
I was told that at the beginning of his first term that they sat, I don't even know if this is true, but it's a good story anyway. It sounds true that they sat Donald Trump down and made him watch all of Lawrence of Arabia movie so that he could understand some of the dynamics in this, in the formation of the states after the First World War. And it's like, well, that's how he learns, right? Anyway.
And now Pulp Fiction. Okay.
Yeah, but it almost feels, Jen, like instability is the point, or is the purpose, because instability everywhere creates a powerful America in relativity, related to that chaos. It can do whatever it wants. It can freedom of action.
And it's not just that. It's that instability breeds profit for a lot of these people in Trump's circle.
Whether you're bombing or building, I guess.
Yeah. They're making a lot of money off this, as people suffer.
Yeah, and we can see in our laws on arms exports some tension between our interests in multilateralism and stability, and that kind of great power interest in unfettered scope of action to impose instability. There's recently been a lot of attention on loopholes in the Canadian law on arms exports, and that means a lot of the arms that we export are, I'm understanding, aiding the foreign direction of the great destabilizer. Could you just explain this and how this? I think you've maybe been right in the middle of this, right?
Yeah. So I've worked on this issue for the better part of 10 years with the NDP off and on, starting especially when Yemen and Liberia was the foreign affairs critic, and we were dealing with the Saudi Arabia LAV deal, right? The General Dynamics deal that became very controversial. Yeah. And then we were able actually to amend the Liberals' arms trade treaty legislation when it came in 2018, when the Liberals finally agreed to accede to the arms trade treaty where the Conservatives hadn't. So this has been a problem for decades. That our arms exports to the United States do not fall under the same export controls as our arms exports to other countries. And that exists since the Defense Production Agreement of the 1950s. What that means is that probably about half of Canadian arms exports, and we're talking military goods and technology, we're talking parts and components, we're not just talking full systems, they cross the border a number of times because our defense production is so integrated. And we have no idea what that is. We don't know the value. We don't know what the contracts are. It's not reported to Parliament. The specifics of that are not controlled. There's no parliamentary oversight. And so this has become a bigger issue in the last few years, specifically because of all of the stuff that was going through the United States and then on to Israel or to other governments that abuse human rights or commit war crimes. Because that does not fall under the same export controls, it means the minister is not looking and approving at each of one of those, right? And Jenny Kwan brought an NDP bill. She brought a bill a few months ago. It came for a vote a few weeks ago, and all it would have done was made the U.S. exports consistent with our exports to everywhere else. That's it. Just bringing it in line with our obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty and with our existing controls. And the Liberals and Conservatives would not support it. They voted it down. There were some Liberals that voted with it. And we're so grateful for them. But overall, there is no appetite among the Liberals or Conservatives to make any changes to Canada's defense production, especially now under this current regime with Carney. And one of the big concerns we have too is this new defense industrial strategy that Carney announced, last month or the month before, includes in it a provision to water down or streamline arms export controls. So we're expecting that more stuff will go on to questionable governments than before. And just to note, it's the U.S. We're currently Rochelle, which is based in Ontario, is sending armored vehicles to the United States government, and they're being used by ICE, right, in communities, right, to suppress. To attack basically American citizens. So that's the kind of thing we're worried about. We have no control over that, and that the government won't act on it.
So military equipment that's made in Canada could be shipped, and that couldn't be shipped to a country because that's our foreign policy, is to not trade arms with that country, not export to that country. But then it could go to the United States and still go to that country because the United States does it. Is that right? So it bypasses our own foreign policies.
Well, something that maybe a minister would deny an export permit for.
Yes.
In Canada, as a direct export, if it goes to the United States and the United States is the designated end user, and then it becomes part of something they ship elsewhere, we have no control over that, and we never know about it either. That's the other thing is, in the United States, Congress has a lot more oversight of their arms exports. We have none in Canada.
Yeah. Interesting. And we talked a little bit about Davos in Carney's speech. I think, it got a lot of praise, but I think it also saw a little bit of a sigh of relief from those progressives that may have loaned their votes to Carney and the Liberals last time to say, oh, we did this right. And some praised it internationally, a lot of praise, as support for middle powers seeking alliances and more of a rules-based system against Trump's great powers model. And I think there's certainly words in there to support that case and give people some hope that perhaps there are solutions. But others called it praised it as a call to the end of the fiction that Canada supports a rules-based approach and embrace the ideas that Canada will judge the same actions differently depending on who commits them. So do you think the words in that speech are now, in hindsight, contradictory, misunderstood? How did you interpret the speech? And I think the other dynamic we're in this week is, a majority for the Carney government. So do you think we'll see some of those words fit actions as well?
Great questions. I was not a fan of Carney's Davos speech, but mainly not because it wasn't a good speech. It was a very good speech, and it was for the intended audience. People really liked it. But having worked on these issues for the last 10 years and seen the Liberals act in some cases and not act in a number of other cases where the NDP has been pushing and pushing and pushing, I was so frustrated when he correctly identified the rupture in the international world order and did not admit that the Liberals have contributed to that rupture, right? By picking and choosing. And I think it's important that we do admit, the rules-based international order has never worked for the global South. It was always kind of selective based on who applied it. But Canada has helped its decline. So that made me frustrated that we weren't seeing those absences. And when I think about, post Davos, what does Carney mean for our foreign policy? What is it? We don't have a defined foreign policy. We don't have a national security strategy. The feminist foreign policy is dead. We are not really sure what values he's applying, right? At the UN General Assembly this week, Canada did a speech condemning Iran and Iran's retaliation in the Middle East, and didn't mention Israel, didn't call out their violations of international law. Canada won't apply sanctions in cases of, the war in Lebanon. Carney is building new trade agreements with many countries, but some of them are, there's no human rights provisions. When we think about, Canada's relationship with countries like the United Arab Emirates, we're selling weapons to them, and those weapons are being sold on to the RSF in Sudan and being used in that genocide, right? And we have asked the government to do something about that, and they won't. And then I think as a final point, this 5% increase in defense, or sorry, the 5% of GDP in defense, is coming at a time when we need so many more investments in like affordability for Canadians, housing, healthcare, and so on. They haven't fully justified that. And at the same time, they're making a $2 billion cut to our international development funding, which
Yeah.
goes to support civil society holding governments to account. It goes to work on women's rights issues, girls' education, So why are we doing it this way? We don't have a sense of what Carney's foreign policy values are. And that is worrisome to me.
Mm. Yeah, sometimes I've noticed about him, he likes to hold back a little bit and give himself that freedom of action by being very non-committal until late in the process. So it's hard to judge him on what he says, because he often doesn't say very much.
Yeah.
You know, that's a contrast with Mr. Trump, who we're going to just pivot to now, who says a lot. Last month, and you never know what the hell it means. Last November, the Trump administration released a new national security strategy, and at the core of it was a strategic opposition to China and a rejection of international rules and human rights in favor of a great powers approach. It called for working with other unnamed great powers, presumably Russia in that particular passage, as a partner when required, and explicitly told Europe to accommodate Russia on Ukraine. But I think the part that concerns us the most has got to be this Monroe Doctrine revival, the claim that the Americas are his hemisphere, China not welcome, nobody else welcome from other hemispheres, but obviously it's China that he's thinking about. It says the U.S. will, quote, reward and encourage the region's governments, political parties, and movements broadly aligned with our MAGA's principles and strategy, unquote, which seems to signal a pretty blunt disrespect for national sovereignty. And we're going through an Alberta separatism ballot soon, maybe. It sets out a goal of controlling resources and critical supply chains in the Americas. So we've seen these big political trends and stories in the Americas in response to this, both for and against Trump, and align with Trump and align, this thing about enlist, right? He wants to enlist people. What do you think? What do you think that means for the political party? What has it meant for the political parties and movements in North and South America, who are parties that base their approach on human rights and national sovereignty? How is that kind of shaking out in the aftermath of this? Everybody coming to terms with understanding what he's saying and what he's doing.
Yeah, well, I think it makes it even more urgent for left-leaning parties to organize well and to win elections. I think, that, right? Like the survival of democracy is at stake in a lot of cases. And you do see, especially in the Americas, this, pro-Trump, no Trump, falling down the lines of right-wing parties versus progressive parties, right? I think someone like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico has managed that relationship pretty well so far. She's been quite critical, especially on the case of abuses of migrants who are detained in the States, and more vocal on that lately. But she's also worked with the Trump administration, on the stuff with cartels, for example. So once they're in government, they have to walk that fine line in a similar way to what I think Carney is sometimes doing. I don't know. I'm worried about this national security strategy and the impacts for potential implications for Canada, especially when he talks about the critical minerals. Like, what does that mean for us? The cooperation with Russia was not well received by a lot of folks in Europe, right? Like that is deeply alarming to a lot of friends there who are working in different, progressive and centrist governments. They're very worried about this. So I'm not sure how this is going to go. One thing I was thinking about when thinking a little bit about how people organize against Trump is there's this new group of states in the global south called the Hague Group.
Uh-huh.
And it's not specific to Trump, right? But they're associated with the Progressive International. And so you have like Colombia, for example, and Bolivia. And working with other states in the global south, like South Africa, they're specifically focusing on Palestine and international law right now. But we may increasingly see some like-minded states, governments, political parties on the left doing that kind of organizing work and solidarity work on specific thematic issues. And I think the Progressive International is one place that we should start looking a lot more. We had at the Broadbent Institute Progress Summit, the head of Progress International come, and I think that's maybe we need to be building those movements more, right, among all of us, because we're all in this together.
And there are definitely parties, and many governing parties, like Sheinbaum's Marina Party, or Lula in Brazil, a country of what, I don't know, 300 million, 250 million, big country. Mexico, big country. Canada, big country.
Yeah.
And then if you can get, some of the smaller ones, like the Colombias, which currently has a progressive government, Venezuela, we don't know. Chile seems to be going the other way, right? Got the madman in Argentina. Sorry, what's his? I'm suddenly forgetting his Javier
Milei.
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 So a real mixed bag. But people we can work with.
Absolutely.
Seems to me, and have something in common with.
Yeah, and a lot of these countries have really strong civil society movements, right?
Yes.
Like labor, human rights movements, environmental movements as well. And so it doesn't have to be just political parties. Like we need to be building much more solidarity, I think, among all of us who are looking to create a better world, right?
Maybe that's a question
certainly,
we should...
the far right's doing that, and I think people miss how much that organization is, and not on that. Although I did notice in the past days where in Europe some of the progressive leaning governments are coming together to talk about addressing the far right rise. So I think we're seeing that coalescing that can hopefully continue.
I was going to say, Nikki, next week we got Bruce coming on, and
we do.
Often a lot of good conversations happen within the global labor movement around jobs and prices and things like that, and what are we going to do? So that might be one more place where these conversations can happen, and we can develop strategies. I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, Jen, we've got one last question for you before we break, and thanks so much for joining us today. Just a tiny question. So thinking very politically, where do you see, after all this conversation, some of the spots where the labor movement and the Federal NDP could focus Canadians on to best press the case for human rights and a peaceful world that's good for prosperity of Canadians? Or I guess the inverse, which is that a global regime that's based on unilateralism and great power control actually hurts our futures. What are the opportunities here for the NDP?
Well, I think there's a number of opportunities, and at a federal level, we're a small but mighty caucus. So doing our best to push back on a number of these different issues. Labor has always been so helpful also in developing our human rights policies. And I have to say, whether it's the CLC or Unifor or whatever other union, they all have great human rights experts who are often helping us to really join with folks globally and make sure that we're pushing for good jobs for everybody, for protection for workers for everyone, environmental protections and so on. So I think that will absolutely continue. And, as we were saying just a few minutes ago, I think increasingly there's movements of folks working together to try and unite on specific issues. Like, so for Palestine, for example, we have seen labor movements in many countries, standing up now on that. We've seen dock workers in Europe refuse to unload weapons destined for Israel, for example. So we can start to do some of those, collective actions. And I think for the NDP, we've always been pretty clear that, the promotion of human rights and solidarity, it's part of our values, but it's part of Canadian values too, right? And so continuing to ask these questions like, who profits from war? Who profits from chaos and insecurity? What should a Canadian foreign policy based on human rights and protections for everyone, what should that look like? Who, how are we also protecting Canadians at this time whose key concerns are about affordability, how they're going to pay their mortgage?
Absolutely.
Like all of this stuff is kind of interlinked. So we have a lot of advocacy to do, a lot of work to do on all of it, but hope everyone listening will join us in doing that important work.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the excellent work that you're doing. And it's been a real delight to have you on the show and be able to talk about these issues and connect, the what seems like a very troubled world right now to home base, issues of how do you pay the mortgage? How do you pay the rent? How do you buy the groceries? How do you put gas in the tank?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for
Thanks,
having
Jen.
me. Okay. Good to see you.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting interview with Jen, and really touching on, things that are so far away, but, really connect with home base. And I think that's, I think that's a tough case to make politically, but maybe a little easier now because we see these impacts of foreign wars on us. What do you think?
Yeah, I
It's
think
a tough
it's such an
job, though.
interesting time because I think in all of our discussions today too, we're coming back into these pressures largely being brought in from global forces, but still Canadians are so centered on what I think that was happening around their kitchen table. But it's because of some of these global forces that they're seeing these impacts, and we're seeing this increased conversation about affordability and cost of living. So it's sort of like, as we keep going back to how the changes we've had in the world since Trump has come in, one person really, let alone all the other ongoing conflicts and geopolitical pressures since the pandemic, things like healthcare. I think if we do keep coming back to, how do Canadians understand where that was happening in their lives and where that impact is. So it's like maybe we don't think about these foreign affairs issues very often, but they're definitely what are actually the conversation that is impacting us.
Yeah, it's interesting. Another theme that we've talked about today a little bit has been that big tech kind of issue. And one of the things I've thought about with this war, maybe I'm a little off base on this, but it's my perception that a lot of people died in this war in Iran. But it seems to be a war mostly about drones and bombing infrastructure and things. It's as if, we created this world, humanity, created this world with these strands of communication and supply chains. And we thought they were robust, but then we found out they're actually extremely fragile. And it didn't take much. And that's it's almost like that's the target. People get killed on the way to the target. And really, that's kind of not the news, which is bizarre to me. Feels weird. And it's just this kind of weird sense for me anyway. I feel like between that and the tech surveillance pricing and these kind of things, it's like there's kind of this system that's running against us. And we're not in control of it very much. And it's not working out all that great.
No, and I feel like we're in a repeat conversation. I think there was like all this surprise here in BC in 2021 when we had huge atmospheric rivers and flooding and the highway literally broke and supply chains broke. And we're like, oh, supply chains and infrastructure are important to be proactive on, right? So, I agree. It's almost like people are still existing in an old world order right now, as even though, and partly that's probably just the pace of change and the uncertainty and trying to grapple with it when you are just thinking about, can you afford to drive to work or pick up groceries?
And then, of course, the question of, what do we do about it? We can't stop Mr. Trump.
It's the what do you
Not
do
now.
about it? Yeah,
What do we
when
do?
there's no...
We're not empowered to, or we're, and this part of the conversation, I guess, with Jen is, how do we try and get our hands around the potential of containing this crazy guy?
And
He's
acknowledging the fine
destabilizing.
line that leaders are walking whenever it comes to anything touching Trump. And so, we are in complex times.
So, okay. Well, anyway, I like that interview. It was an interesting conversation, and let's take a break though, and we'll come back with Love It or Heave It. Okay, before we wrap up, we've come to that part of the show we call Love It or Heave It, about something you love and want to keep or something you'd like to heave and forever forget. What have you got this week, Nikki?
I'm going with some good news this week
All
in the
right.
BC legislature. So we have two current BC cabinet ministers celebrating some baby news.
All right.
Adding on the Minister of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills, Jessie Sunner, announcing she's expecting her first child this summer, being really open about her process with her partner and their journey to get there, which I think is always refreshing for the public to see from politicians. And so we also have Infrastructure Minister Bowen Ma has announced her news a while ago, but took to social media to celebrate both of them. Actually, a really cute photo of them being barefoot in the legislature and pregnant and doing their jobs. So
That's funny.
but I just want to put a little pin into a quick look at last week's episode where we talked about the BC legislature bringing in some new legislation for local government officials for parental leave, which would need to come in for a more consistent approach across the province. Because what normally happens here for a cabinet minister, and over 50% of this government's cabinet ministers are women, which is a huge celebration. What normally happens is they have a brief leave and someone else covers off for them. And so, as we talked about, there's a really slim majority here in BC. So the legislature goes until the end of May, possibly a little bit into June if it gets extended. Then it got a break until October. So with these slim majorities, ministers are, sort of have that pressure to get back and to be back on the job for votes. So there's going to be, a high pressure situation during some good news. There was the very impressive Darlene Rochford, who comes from the labor movement, elected in the last election, made a lot of news because the slim majority, and there was a really important confidence vote on the budget, managed to get on virtually and vote for the budget last year, 6 hours after giving birth. And knowing Darlene, I know there was nothing that was going to stop her from doing that.
No pain too much to bear to get in there and vote, I guess.
No,
right?
not for Darlene Rochford. So,
Right.
but I think a lot of people's response too was that as much of a force as she is, it would be great to see our elected officials be able to take that parental leave that we fight for other people as well. And so, big love to those new Democrats coming from the cabinet members who are pregnant. But I think we'd really love to see where we get to a time where they get that leave and some of those rights that other people get when they're taking parental leave that they're fighting for others.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, as we discussed last week. It's, being an MLA, you're a representative. So there's kind of two forces tearing. One is, you are a worker and you're working, and some of them work pretty damn hard, thankfully. But on the other hand, they're elected, and they're elected to do a job. So there is a tension there, and finding your way through it. Not, I guess. Well, we haven't found it yet, but more work to be done.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet, and not with slim majorities, probably in the near future. But Okay, Tom, what are you loving or heaving this week?
Well, Nikki, ever since we started this podcast, I've been harping on about food prices and that there's something systemically wrong. So I am loving seeing conservatives lose their minds and show their collective uselessness as some key New Democrats across the country start to advance some ideas about how we make food cheap again. A couple months ago, you raised Premier Wab Kinew launching an investigation into the causes of rising grocery costs and possible solutions. We've also recently talked about how a few weeks ago, Mayor Olivia Chow in Toronto City Council directed the city administration to investigate if a public grocery store model could be created to help control prices. Federal NDP leader Avi Lewis has been on the issue, and the emerging problem of so-called predatory pricing that we talked about at the top of the show, which is when companies track your data and then use it to increase the checkout price, just, special for you. Last month, the Kinew government in Manitoba tabled a bill to outlaw predatory pricing. And last week, Ontario NDP leader Mart Stiles pushed something similar, asked Doug Ford to adopt what his good friend Wab has done. But the other part of this is I am also just loving watching the Conservatives lose their mind about this whole thing. Last week, Doug Ford condemned Toronto's move on groceries and opposed Mart's predatory pricing proposal, but really no reason why, except it's socialism, no explanation. AM talk hosts and Globe Mail editorials have also taken similarly content-free, highly ideological opposition. And what I particularly love about their lick-splittled hysteria is just how much it sells the very idea that they're trying to defeat. Like I said last week, we don't know if a different way of doing things can be better at keeping food prices in check. But I think we can say with certainty that the Conservative opposition even taking a look and them tying themselves to the boat anchor claim that what's going on today is the market working as it should, well, that is reason enough to keep pressing, keep investigating, and keep showing who's on the side of Canadians buying the groceries and who's not.
Yeah. Well, and I think like it's this pivot point too. You know, one thing we didn't talk about is BC in the midst of all of the reconciliation discussions also brought in a task force around looking at the impacts of the war in the Middle East on British Columbians and pushing Canada as well. So interesting where it's like seeing jurisdictions saying, okay, we understand there are going to be impacts on people and businesses and how do we get ahead of them? And I think that's where the public appetite is right now. Like they can feel that impact on their pocketbook, telling them that there's nothing to see here and no, your grocery prices are fine if somebody's changing them on you. I don't think is actually on the right track with where the public is feeling the pressures for their families.
No, I mean, I don't think the public feels that big tech and big grocery stores are on their side at all and trying to help them. I think
so.
The general feeling is that we're trying to use our own data against us to screw us. And that's just an overwhelming feeling right now. So, anyway, it's good to see people tackling this thing and trying to put some ideas forward. And I think the New Democrats are going to get some traction if they.
It looks like it, yeah.
Yeah, well, on this kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, traction,
we'll see you over
and
the next
also
weeks.
It's amazing to watch some of the Conservatives just walk right into it.
I know.
So there we go.
It's great. I love that part the best. Okay, that's our show for this week. But Nikki, we'll be back next Monday with Canadian Labour Congress President Bea Brusk, who will talk about her next steps as delegates to the CLC convention gathering in Winnipeg for Monday, May the 11th.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, have a great week.
Thanks for joining Left East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We'd love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left East to West. We'll see you next week.